got the official, and we're recording. Okay, cool. Well, anyone else have any questions or thoughts before we get going? No? Okay, cool. Well, my name is Meredith Arend. I am one of the academic and career advisors here at Pacific. I also run our Health Professions Advantage Scholars program. I'm seeing nodding heads. Okay, yeah, and I see some familiar faces. So that means I tend to talk about interviewing a lot, usually in the context of grad school, but also in terms of jobs. So I'm really excited to talk with you guys about this today. I will tell you, it was like incredibly difficult for me to get enough content into this, but I felt like we were covering enough and that I wouldn't go over the hour. So I probably will err on the side of being too long, but I'm going to do my very best to leave lots of time for questions, because I feel like that's what y'all are here for, is to really like get your questions addressed. So as we get going, if I start talking too fast, if you want to ask a question in the middle, please feel free to stop me. It's not going to hurt my feelings. I'm not going to get upset. I love questions. So feel free to raise your hand or a hand on Zoom or throw it in the chat. And I'm more than willing to address those as we go. All right. With that, let's see if I can get my slides to advance. That is the true question. All right. So what I decided when I was thinking about how to frame this, because I literally do classes where I have multiple classes talking about interviewing, I thought what would be helpful would be to start with the most common questions I get asked about interviewing. So starting with like, what's the point of an interview? What should you expect during your interview? What are common questions they're going to ask? Are there like tips or tools or strategies that are super useful with interviewing? What to do if you're nervous about an interview, which, let's be real, everybody's nervous about interviewing, right? What you should do before, during, and after an interview, and then some good resources that can help with that. So that's what the plan is to cover. And then as you guys have questions, we can talk more about any of these specific areas too. All right, so when I think about what the point of an interview is, it's really about determining fit. So it's a two-way street. I think that sometimes we get stuck in this idea that it's like this like really aggressive, I don't know, like flashing the light on you interrogation of like trying to get all to know you, but really it should be a conversation and it should be a two-way street. It should be a situation where the interviewer is trying to get to know you and you're trying to get to know the interviewer and the opportunity that you're applying for. So the three main questions that generally come up are, why me, why here, and why now? So why are you a good fit for this opportunity? Why is this opportunity a good fit for you in the sort of space that you're in now, your educational or career journey? And why this particular place, right? Why is this organization a good fit for you? So we'll get into some of these, but those are usually the core of what they're really getting at in any interview. So in terms of what to expect, I think one of the first things to think about is format with any interview. And maybe that's not something you've thought about before, but there are lots of different ways that folks can structure their interview for you. So the traditional interview is generally a one-on-one interview. That means it's one interviewer and one interviewee, right? I think that's what most of us think of when we think of interviews, but there are other options. So there's a panel interview. That's when there is one interviewer or one interviewee and multiple interviewers. Sort of like makes you feel like you're answering multiple people's questions, right? The other option could be sort of the opposite, where it is a group interview, where there are multiple interviewees at the same time, and sometimes just one interviewer, but it could also be multiple interviewers in that space. Obviously, that changes the dynamic a lot when you are literally sitting next to the people you are possibly competing with for an opportunity. This also comes up with grad school. Sometimes they like to do fun group interviews. I know I've sat through a few of those. So those are definitely a challenge. And then multiple minis. Now, this is something that when it comes to job opportunities, you guys generally aren't going to see. But since this is a broad topic of interviewing, I wanted to include it because if you are thinking about interviewing for grad school, some grad programs utilize this a lot. So it's usually medical schools, sometimes counseling or psychology-based programs love multiple minis. Things like physician's assistant or some of the other healthcare programs really like it. And the idea of a multiple mini is kind of what it sounds like. it's multiple mini interviews. So that can involve stations where you're going from place to place and maybe you're doing one question at each station, or maybe it's an activity at one of the stations. So you're like, an activity, what could that be? Sometimes it's doing a written out response to something. Sometimes they have you actually build things. They give you some vague instructions and you have to make something. There's all sorts of different ways they can structure it, but that's another option for format. The other thing I think about in terms of format is it in person, right? That's a traditional way we think about interviewing being done, but it could also be a phone interview. I would say if you're going to have multiple interviews, which does happen a fair bit, you might expect the first one to be by phone and then switch to either a virtual or an in-person format for the second. And then the virtual format. And I would say because of COVID, we are seeing a lot more virtual interviews. Have any of you guys ever experienced a virtual interview? Brooklyn, I know Vanessa has. Yeah, right. So this is something that is becoming more and more common, maybe just because of the fact that folks weren't able to meet in person. But we also see that there are some really big opportunities that come with virtual interviews. The main one being around the lens of equity, right? So you can get a much more diverse group of folks who can come in for an interview if they're not tied to having to come in person, right? That can take away barriers like transportation or the cost of coming out to interview. Maybe it's childcare or whatever it is for folks. So it is becoming more and more common. And I think most of us have gotten a lot of experience with being in those virtual formats, but it is a little bit different to interview like that versus say, go to a class. The last one I'll mention in terms of format, because I think this is something folks have not generally heard of before, is that you can have an open versus a closed interview. The other word for closed is blind, meaning that in an open interview, the interviewer has all of your materials in front of them, like your resume or any like application questions you submitted beforehand, versus a blind where they don't know anything about you. You're just coming and you're being in front of them in that space and they're only hearing your answers to those questions. I would say blind interviews are not as common for jobs, but there are definitely some grad programs who love a good blind interview. And that can really, again, change the way you're answering questions, knowing whether or not they're going to see your application materials before you come into the space. So maybe not surprisingly, you should try to figure out what the format of your interview is, and then you should try to prepare based on what that format is, okay? Another question I get asked a lot is where you should look depending on the format of your interview, right? So this usually comes up with panels and virtual interviews the most. Your goal is to make eye contact, but please don't be creepy, right? I think most of us know what the creepy staring thing feels like. It's not good. Don't do it in an interview, but do make eye contact. If you're in a panel interview situation, you want to look at all of the folks who are interviewing you, but you want to spend maybe a little bit more time on whoever is asking that particular question. Now, when it comes to virtual interviews, again, that can be tricky. You generally want to look into the camera and not the screen. Again, can be tricky, right? But if you're making sort of more sweeping looks, it can kind of look like you're looking at the camera, even if you're sort of looking in the general vicinity. So you can practice with that. When it comes to virtual interviews, I highly suggest you record yourself practicing so you can see things like, oh, what does it look like when I look directly at the camera versus sort of generally in the vicinity of the camera, right? So try those things out. No matter the format, think about what distractions might be around for that. And it looks different based on what your format is. So obviously virtual is going to have its own set of fun distractions, but phone and or in person can also have distractions. So think about what those are going to be and do your best to come up with a plan to either avoid them or to counter them if they come up. And then the last thing I threw on here was, I feel like most of us have almost forgotten what it's like to go to an interview in person. Maybe it's just me, maybe I've just forgotten that. But I found that during the pandemic, I drive places less, I go out and do less. And so this idea of like, oh, wait, I need to know that I know how to get to wherever this place is, or, oh, I might need to pay for parking wherever this place is, or figure all of those pieces out, right? So I encourage you to think about where the location is. Do you know this place? Do you need to give yourself extra time? Whatever it may be. But I feel like it needs to be said because I think many of us are not necessarily prepared for that anymore. The last thing I'll also say is that you do want to consider your location in terms of how you're dressing for the space. I say this because I used to do admissions for some healthcare programs, and they used to do interviews inside a hospital setting. And I used to get feedback all the time from the folks who were doing interviews about folks coming in inappropriately dressed to be in a hospital setting. What does that mean? 6-inch heels when you're walking around in a hospital setting. Not super great. So think about where you're going to be and make sure that your dress is appropriate for whatever that particular situation or interview looks like. Make sense so far? Yeah? Tracking? Any questions so far? Yeah. Yes, of course, Brooklyn. Thanks, Brooklyn. So if you guys couldn't hear on Zoom, Brooklyn was kind of sharing about keeping your, well, I'm going to use your word, electronical devices out of the way and keeping them from distracting you while you're waiting for your interview. All right. Thanks, Brooklyn. So just a few more tips for virtual interviews. Test your tech, please, 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 folks, test your tech. I've heard some horror stories from students who did not do that until the day of and horrible things happened. Horrible things meaning their computer needed to be updated. They had to reschedule something. Nothing you want to have happen to your interview. Understand the requirements, especially if it's a virtual interview. Sometimes they will have system requirements for whatever your computer or device is. So make sure you know what those are, or if there's anything like, I have seen students doing grad school interviews where they had requirements about how your name was entered on the screen, or if you had what to do about your background, if they wanted it blurred, if they wanted you to use a particular virtual background to kind of keep it a clean slate, right? So pay attention to those things. In terms of your name on the screen, please keep it professional, folks. I know sometimes we use Zoom for other things, or maybe it's your FaceTime. Let's try to make sure that before you log that on, that maybe whatever nickname you have or fun sounding name you use for other things, maybe change to a more professional name to have on your screen. Think about your background. I think the other thing that's really big that students sometimes forget about is lighting, right? I think we've all spent a lot of time on Zoom in the last 2 years. Lighting makes a huge difference. And we don't want anything that's going to distract the person doing your interview. And so being able to see you clearly and having good light is ridiculously important. I would also say, think about where your camera is. Like I was talking to Vanessa before we got started about where the camera was going to be for this recording, right? Different heights make you look different ways. And so it's important to play with that. Again, that's why it's important to test everything out before you get into that space of the actual interview, but see if it's something you like. I know personally, I'm generally propping my laptop up on all sorts of things before I record. Board games is probably my favorite thing at my house that I use. Here at the office, it's random leftover boxes, right? But getting that at the right height can also be really important to setting the stage. Also, please consider your internet connection. That's just not fun for any of us. So think about if you want to try to get a wired connection if you're going to be meeting virtually, if you can sit closer to a router, if you just need a knock in your dorm room, because let's face it, some of the dorm rooms here have atrocious internet, right? I know. Yes, I'm seeing the nods. Yes. So maybe you go make sure you're in the library for your interview or whatever it is. But think about that. Okay. Think about what that internet connection looks like. So let's get into some of these common interview questions. I'm gonna just get into them so that we don't take too long, being mindful of time here. So the first one I think that's really important for you guys to think about preparing for is probably the most common question you will get asked in an interview. And it's usually the first question you're going to be asked in the interview. Tell me about yourself. Have any of you guys been asked that question in an interview before? Yeah? Yeah. So it's one that you should practice and have something prepared to answer. Obviously, it's pretty open-ended. I also think it seems really easy, but then you go to answer it and it's kind of hard to figure out how to frame it. I kind of like to think about it like it's your elevator pitch, that sort of short statement about who you are. but sort of modified for whatever audience that you're working with in that interview. And you generally want it to sort of set the stage, be your intro paragraph for the rest of your interview. So there's a couple different ways you can organize it. Sometimes it's nice to have a way to think about how to organize something like tell me about yourself. So I've got a few different options up here. So one is to think about it as past, present, and future, or sometimes folks like to go present, past, future. Situation, skills, strengths, or summary of experiences, or opening, motivational story, academic and supporting experiences, and then a closing. I'll give you an example of one of these in just a second. The other thing I wanted to make sure to say is it's okay to add some personal details. So no, do you want to tell them your entire life story and tell them about the house you grew up in? Probably not, okay? That's not what they're here to hear about. But is it okay to mention a few details that either tell them about things that you're passionate about, help them understand things that are, you know, important to you or gave you skills, strengths, or things that you're going to be able to utilize coming into this job? Heck yes. Sometimes it's just nice to have a point of connection, because at the end of the day, again, this is a two-way street, right? It's a connection and a conversation that you're having with somebody. And so sometimes giving them a little detail helps to build that. For example, I always like to mention that I have dogs. I should say dog now. And I think it is something that I have seen build so many connections when I've been in interviews. I can't tell you how many times afterwards someone's like, what kind of dog do you have? Tell me about your dog. Oh, you have an Aussie? I love Aussies. I was thinking about getting an Aussie, right? So, you know, I think it can be this wonderful way to create connection. Or maybe it's telling somebody like, I have a passion for doing jigsaw puzzles, which I do, by the way. Does that tell somebody you're probably pretty detail oriented, that you can probably, you're probably good at projects and longer term things, that you are good at seeing how things fit together, right? So those things can tell somebody something that's also useful to the message you're giving them about why you're going to be a good fit for this job. Okay. Here's a fabulous example about tell me about yourself. I'm going to take a breath because I feel like I've been talking for a while before I read this. So this is using that situation, skills, strengths, and then summary of experiences. So it starts, I'm a senior at Pacific University, majoring in biology and seeking to work in the area of plant propagation. This was so not me, by the way. I can envision working in a horticultural operation anywhere in the West Coast. Then we go into skills, right? So I've gained a lot of skill recently in experiment design and field research. I can organize a research project from start to finish and know how to present results in person or in writing. I'm also very proficient in statistical analysis. Then we go into strengths. So I'm a self-motivated and focused, and I can perform tasks well with little supervision. I get my best results when working against a deadline and teaming up with other committed people. Then we go into summary of experiences. I've assisted with 2 faculty research projects over the last 2 years, which, man, rockstar, the student is pretty awesome, right? And I'm preparing to present findings on my own research into challenges with organic cultivation of elephant garlic in the Pacific Northwest. I've also worked in native plants nursery for 3 years. So you can see if this person was maybe applying for an opportunity to do research around anything in the horticulture world, that this could feel appropriate for a tell me about yourself. It could be a job opportunity that was maybe in horticulture, right? You could see how this person could use this in a variety of settings, but you get a good idea of who they are and sort of what they're passionate and excited about and what the skills and strengths they're bringing to this opportunity are. Yeah? Questions about tell me about yourself before we move on? No. Okay, cool. So beyond just this idea of tell me about yourself, you could also get asked some other sort of general icebreakery kind of questions or get to know you questions. Again, seemingly easy, but also deceptively hard, because if you're like me, I don't know how I would answer what my favorite quote is off the top of my head, or what's an instant skill that you would like to learn and why. But you could get asked these questions, and just know that it's okay to take a beat and a breath before you answer them. Taking a pause is totally okay in an interview. And also there is no right or wrong answer here. So it's a matter of them just wanting to get to know who you are and learning a little bit more about you. A lot of times they'll say in a low pressure way, which I don't know if I agree with the low pressure, but they can be also very, very fun questions as well. So next kind of questions you might get are scenario-based questions. This is where the interviewer sets up a situation or a story and then asks you to address it or how you would handle it. So they're looking for critical thinking or problem-solving skills. Again, no right or wrong answers, but there are ways to sort of work to enhance either the values, strengths, or skills you naturally have, or what you think might be important in the job or opportunity that you're going into. So what's an example of this? This is like my favorite one. So it's a parking garage scenario. I stole it from an MMI, so probably not something you're going to get in a job interview, but I still think it's a really great one to think about. So the scenario goes something like this. The parking garage at your place of work has assigned parking spots. On leaving your spot, you are observed by the garage attendant as you back into a neighboring car. Oops. Knocking out its left front headlight and denting the left front fender. The garage attendant gives you the name and office number of the owner of the neighboring car, telling you that he's calling ahead to the car owner, good old Tim, and letting him know that he is expecting you. So you enter Tim's office, and what do you say? Right? So again, no right or wrong answer here. They're just trying to see what your thought process is, how you would handle this. So I shared this question actually with my spouse a while back, and it was such a good reminder that we all think about these things differently. Because the first thing he said to me is, why the heck are you going to Tim's office? And I was like, what do you mean, why am I going to Tim's office? That's the scenario. And he was like, yeah, but I would say I wouldn't go to Tim's office. Why isn't Tim coming down to the garage? I just hit his car. Doesn't he want to see the car? Doesn't he want to take pictures and maybe do a claim? And I was like, huh. And I think it's a perfect example that you could take this in a million different directions and there is no right or wrong answer, which now I think, of course, you would have Tim come down to you because, again, why would you go up to Tim's office? That just seems funny, but really no right or wrong answer. It's just about explaining your thought process and how you might work this out. So you can see my husband's thought process. Well, we got to do a claim, right? There's steps that need to be taken, right? So you can see what his problem solving looks like. All right, questions about this type of question? No. Okay. All right, let's talk about skills, qualities, and qualifications. So these are questions that are going to ask you to define things like your strengths or weaknesses, or display your skills, or highlight your credentials or your competencies. These can be straight out questions where they say, hey, what are your strengths and weaknesses? Or they can be more in disguise. What I mean by that is, it's maybe a strengths-based question that doesn't come out right out and ask for your strengths, like this third one on the list up here. Why should we choose you for this opportunity over other candidates? I think that's a strengths-based question, because the best way to answer something like that is not to talk about those other candidates. It's to talk about why you're amazing and fantastic and you're going to be so great in this position, right? And so looking for those opportunities that are kind of disguised is a great way to approach these kinds of questions. So one of the key skills that I think it's really important for you guys to take away from this today is to be able to think about what are your strengths. So one of my biggest recommendations in terms of preparation for any interview is to sit down and think about what your strengths are. And there's lots of different ways to think about what your strengths are. Are they knowledge-based skills? Are they transferable skills? Are they your personal traits, qualities, and characteristics? But what are your strengths? I put some examples up here in case you needed help thinking about what they might be. But this is a really important step because you're going to get asked about this. And I want you to be able to talk very confidently about what you do well. One way to think about how to figure out what those things are, and there's assessments out there. I've listed a handful. A fellow colleague of mine and I did a presentation where she gave me some information about some assessments. So these are some assessments that you could possibly do if that's your thing. But you can also just kind of reflect and think about, how would someone else describe you? Or what are the compliments you've gotten or feedback you've gotten about yourself that might tell you what those skills and strengths are, right? Look for patterns too, right? So maybe you got this piece of advice from a faculty member over here and this piece from a supervisor here. Is there any commonalities? Can you see those points of connection that really show that that is a big strength area for you? This is something to definitely spend some time doing. What are those strengths that you're going to have that you can talk about? The other key skill that is sort of the flip side of that is identifying your weaknesses. I like to call them growth edges. So I will probably switch language in a second here to calling them that. but it's really important for you to know the flip side of those strengths. Where are the places that you are challenged? Where are there opportunities for your growth? How can we talk about those things? Employers, grad school programs, they want to know that you can be self-aware enough to understand where your growth edges are, right? So I think there's also some bad advice out there to pick when you get asked that like infamous question of, so what are your weaknesses, right? To pick something that's irrelevant or maybe not quite genuine, it's not going to serve you well in most environments. You want it to be genuine. You want it to be a real reflection, because a lot of folks can tell when you're just kind of phoning it in. And you also do want it to be relevant because it shows that you have that awareness of where those areas are that you have opportunities for growth. So again, you can think about where have you received feedback. That's a really great way to think about where those growth edges are. You can also think about the flip side of your strengths. So I think that's a funny one for folks when they first hear it, but a lot of our strengths can also be our weaknesses, right? So I work with a lot of students who are going into healthcare. I myself was in healthcare before I got into higher ed. And I think a commonality for a lot of folks is having a strength around this idea of empathy, right? So that's a wonderful strength to have. And it's a wonderful strength to have to go into healthcare, but that can also have a flip side. And so for many folks, we struggle with setting boundaries, right? Not giving too much of ourselves, not making ourselves a priority, right? And sort of letting that wear down on us. So you can see how that could also be the flip side of your strength. That could be a total growth edge, right? Like we need to learn how to set appropriate boundaries. You can also, it's also really helpful to try to think about the ways you're working on those things. So if somebody asks you the dreaded, what are your weaknesses question, being able to not only be self-aware enough to know what it is, but then also to talk about how you're working on that. So an example would be, okay, so my weakness is public speaking. So I decided I would take a class on public speaking, or I would join the debate team, or the next time my class had a presentation, I would sign up to be the one who talked for most of it, right? Those are ways that you can show that you were actually actively working on that. Or maybe your growth edge is around organization. So you can talk about the fact that you're trying new apps or a calendar system or whatever the heck it is you're trying to work on that with, right? So being able to supply them with actual evidence that not only can you identify your weaknesses or your growth edges, you can make active steps to improve and grow. Does that make sense? Questions about this part? No, okay. So I also get asked a lot of like, well, what are some common examples of weaknesses or growth edges? Because folks sometimes really struggle to think about this. So I've got some examples up here. These are probably the ones I hear most from working with students as possibilities. I will say the public speaking one is probably a lot of people's growth edge. I know it was my growth edge for a long time. Here I am teaching and presenting all the time, right? So you can definitely work on those growth edges. Cool. I would say the procrastinating one is another one that usually we can all relate to on some level, right? I think the other one I hear from a lot of students is struggling to ask for help, right? That can be a weakness, and it can be one that you could actively be working on and give usually really good examples of. Cool. So next type of questions, knowledge of that. So this is something that asks you to have knowledge of, maybe it's the profession you want to go into, or the field, or the college you want to go to grad school at. But it wants you to have some sort of knowledge of something to answer the question. They're looking to make sure you have enough competency or knowledge so that they know you're a good fit for this opportunity, okay? These are where your research and your previous experience can help you. Research in terms of looking up information about this organization or this grad program you're interested in, looking up information about this field that you're trying to get into. So examples of this are things like, what are the skills that would make somebody a good physical therapist, right? So you have to know what the job of physical therapy or therapist is in order to answer that question really well. What do you see as something that may change in this field in the next 10 years? Again, you have to know a bit about whatever field it is you're going into to answer that question really well. Another really common question for this type of question is, why do you want to work here? Or why do you want to go to this graduate program? So you have to know something about that program or that institution or that organization in order to answer that well. And that's where that research part comes in, because you want to be able to fill in all these details about why they're a good fit for you and you're a good fit for them. All right, behavioral questions. I feel like these are some of my favorites and they're kind of hard. So I'm going to show you guys a technique or a tool that I like to use for answering behavioral questions. So those are anything that start with basically, tell me about a time when, describe a situation that, right? So they're asking you to tell a story. They're trying to use your past sort of experiences or behaviors to predict the future, right? They want to know how you handle those things. And so depending on what the story is or the question is, it could be asking you about just about anything. But let me give you some examples. So give me an example of a time you had to learn new material that was challenging for you and how you worked through that. One of my personal favorite questions is, tell me about a time when you had to get creative to solve a problem, right? So you are looking for a story that can explain how you did that, right? Again, showing them your thought process, the skills you have, and how you overcame that. So here's my fancy and favorite tool for answering these questions. Has anyone heard of STAR before, the STAR technique? Vanessa's shaking her head. Anyone else? No. Okay, it's new to you guys. Awesome. So the STAR technique is a way of framing your story. What I've seen countless times with students getting ready for interviews is that we can get lost in our stories, especially if it's a story we've told a lot, or the opposite, that we haven't told a lot. So STAR is a way for you to organize your story to make sure you're covering all of the relevant parts that folks want to hear about in an interview. So it stands for, the S is situation, the T is task, A is action, and R is result. So with S, you are setting the scene. You are giving them the information they need to understand the plot of this story, right? Not too much, not too little, Goldilocks, right? Amount. And then T is for task. So again, you're describing what the actual thing is you needed to do in order to resolve whatever this story is resolving. Action is what you actually did, the steps you actually took. And then R is the result. Now, working with students, I think the things that they forget the most are the T and the R in particular. So it's really important to remember to share the results. So don't just start the story and tell them about it and then forget to let them know how it turned out. No one wants to have the story turned off midway through when you're watching Netflix, right? So you want to know what happens, what's the end, right? So let's look at an example of this. So I don't know why, this is one of my handouts. And I don't know that I ever set up a question for this, which I realized when I was putting this presentation together. But I think that you could look at this question and say, or this answer and think that it could be answering a couple different things. I think that tell me about a time you got creative to solve a problem would be a great example of when this STAR story would work really well. So the situation, advertising revenue was falling for my college newspaper, The Review, and large numbers of long-term advertisers were not renewing contracts. So now we're going to set up the task. So my goal was to generate new ideas, materials, and incentives that would result in at least a 15% increase in advertisers from the year before, which also, I love it when they throw in numbers like 15%, because one, folks love numbers, but two, I'm also like, how do you get that number? How was it 15%? But okay. Action. I designed a new promotional packet to go with the rate sheet and compared the benefits of the Review circulation with other ad media in the area. I also set up a special training session for the account executives with a School of Business Administration professor who discussed the competitive selling strategies. So you can see they took two really big action steps there. And then the R, so the result. We signed contracts from 15 former advertisers for daily ads and 5 for special supplements. We increased our new advertisers by 20% over the same period last year. So it's very specific, tells you exactly what happened, tells you what the actions the person took were, lays out the plot here of what we needed to do with the task, and it gave you enough information in that first S for you to really understand the story. So that's what the STAR technique is. What do you guys think of it? Yeah? Could you see yourselves using it? For some folks, something like this doesn't work well. And if this is not the thing for you, it's not going to hurt my feelings if you never use STAR. But I think it's a good thing to think about, especially in terms of making sure when you are telling story that you're including all 4 of these parts with it. Okay. This was one that came up. So questions for the interviewer. So I had thought of that one. So you definitely should plan on preparing questions 100%. Again, this comes down to it being a two-way street. You should have questions you want to know about this opportunity. So think about those, what those are. These should not be questions you can easily find the answer to. So if you can Google this and find it in like 10 seconds, probably don't ask it. That's not usually a good question. It should be something that you can't easily find on your own. They also can be ways to highlight the things that you're really passionate about or the things that are most important to you. So one of the things I recommend students do is to think about what your non-negotiables are. What are the things you need from this opportunity? And making sure you ask questions that get at that so that you have that information when you decide whether or not this opportunity is the right one for you. It also can be a way to express interest, right? So if you're asking them about very specific things about what they're doing within the organization or a particular project they have going, that shows that you took the time to research it and that you're excited about it, right? It gives you this opportunity to highlight, like, this is why we're a great fit, because you're doing this thing and I love this thing. I'm super passionate about it. I want to be involved in it, right? So again, it reinforces why you're a great fit. And you can also ask about next steps. So if they didn't tell you naturally in the course of that interview what's coming next, totally appropriate to ask. So what should I expect, right? So that's also another great kind of question to ask. You asked about other questions you could ask. I think it can go in many different directions. I think it depends on the interview and the opportunity that you're interviewing for you to help sort of decide what's most important. Are you thinking about job or are you thinking about grad school?
Kind of either. I think the one question that I always ask is,
Mhm.
do you have anything about hiring here?
Yes, I think that's an excellent question. So if you couldn't hear that on Zoom, she basically said her question was about if they had any hesitancies or maybe, you know, things that were holding them back from wanting to hire her. And I think that's a wonderful question to ask. It gives you the opportunity to sort of fill in anything you didn't already get to say, or if there's a gap area in your resume or your skills, you can tell them how you plan to address that, right? That's a wonderful question. I think questions about the environment or the culture of the place are really great. I think if they didn't give you a lot of details about the specifics of what your job looks like on a daily basis, if it's a job opportunity, that's a great one to ask. It just really depends on what the opportunity is, and it should definitely be tailored to whatever that opportunity is, the questions you're asking. Is that helpful? Cool. Any other questions before we move on from this type of question? Yeah. So just some basic tips about question prep. I do encourage you to find some practice questions. It's always good for us to practice. Here's my pro tip though. Don't practice too much, right? So we don't want you to get to the point where you become a robot. Nobody wants that. Or for them to ask you something that's off script and that throws you. So it's all about finding that Goldilocks spot of practicing and getting comfortable with the mechanics of what you're doing, but not necessarily scripting every answer you're going to address in an interview. If it wasn't made clear already, research is really important. So finding out more information about the opportunity or the organization that you want to be a part of. Be yourself. I think one of the things that can be hard is that we get nervous or we think that maybe we have too many growth edges for an opportunity and we maybe want to hide those away. But the truth is that people are genuinely more attracted to, in terms of folks they want to hire, folks that are more genuine and authentic. Also, you don't want to get into a situation where it isn't really a good fit between you and this opportunity. And so being genuine really helps with that. One of my other favorite tips in terms of preparing for an interview is to think about what your greatest hits are. So what is it, no matter what, that you know you want those folks to know about you? What is the most important things to you that you think make you such an amazing candidate for this opportunity? I also I also highly suggest you think about story. Story is really hard to come up with on the fly. So taking some time out to think about some stories that you could utilize for multiple different questions is really helpful. And again, it's just really hard to come up with them on the fly. So I really encourage you to think about what those stories are that you could utilize. The last thing I'll say is completing a self inventory can be really helpful. This can be things like your strengths and weaknesses, like we already talked about. It can also be your non-negotiables. What do you need from this opportunity? What are the things that are an immediate turn off or a nope, I'm nope carding that if you hear during that interview. It's important to pay attention and know what those are going into it. Sometimes we don't know till we get there, but I can tell you there's definitely been times where I interviewed for things and I was just even setting up the interview, stuff happened that I was like, oh, this is not okay. Like not going to pursue this situation. So pay attention to those things and know what those non-negotiables are for you. And the other thing I really encourage you to have going into your interview is your questions. Take some time, think about what they are. I really encourage folks to write them down so that you don't have to, again, come up with them on the fly. That is an important thing to kind of have pre-prepared. I love actually physically writing things. I think that's super helpful. But you can do whatever works best for you, but definitely think about what those questions are you have. Okay, this is one of my other favorite questions that I get asked a lot. So what do you do if you're nervous? Well, first of all, everybody's nervous in an interview for the most part. There's a lot of psychological research out there that when they need to stress people out, they put them through an interview before they do whatever research it is, right? Isn't that absolutely wonderful? That it is a non-invasive way for them to stress you out. So they will use an interview. If they really want to stress you out, they'll do an interview where your interviewer does not respond. They are completely flat, no affect, no responses back to you. And they can just watch people's cortisol spike, right? Our stress hormone. It's stressful. It makes us nervous, right? So firstly, it's totally normal. I do think that preparing does help. So make sure you're taking that step to think through these things, do your research, practice, all of that kind of good stuff. We talked about practicing, but not too much. Think about if you have any nervous behaviors. Most of us have some, right? Maybe it's fiddling with some jewelry. Maybe it's like me, I need to walk around when I'm doing stuff. When I first started giving big presentations, I used to take a rubber band so that I had something to do with my hands because it was just terrible if my hands were left alone. But think about what those are for you and think about how you might work to make them not distracting, right? So we don't want to completely obliterate some of those things because sometimes they actually are helpful to you to keep you calm, but we also don't want them to distract. So if your hands are doing this the whole time you're interviewing, it's probably going to be distracting. So maybe we work on not doing that. If you're doing a virtual interview, the cool thing is you have a camera frame, right? So you can think about, okay, I need to, wiggle my hands the whole time. I will keep them below the frame, right? So use that frame to your advantage. The other thing I'll say about body language is that there are, one of the things I cut from this presentation, this idea of power poses, or the fact that there are body language things that tell people we're nervous or anxious, or maybe we're less confident. Things like crossing ourselves, crumpling in, sort of making ourselves small, right? Whereas the opposite, sort of making ourselves big, straight up like Wonder Woman posing, right, is seen as more confident. So we want to think about those things too. Are we sending off body language that says that we're confident? Remember to take a breath. It is okay. It is good for us. Taking a pause is okay. Again, remember it's a conversation. I encourage you to engage in self-care, whatever works for you to help with your nervous energy. It looks different for folks, so know what that is, and I encourage you to engage in it. And then the last thing I'll say is try a pep talk. I think people underestimate that small piece as well. So that could be a pep talk from somebody who cares about you, a parent, a significant other, a friend. Sometimes it's just nice to have somebody here say, I've got you. You've got this, whatever it is. The other thing that is sort of maybe slightly nerdy of me, but I will share my tip with you. I put Post-its up. So if I am going to be interviewing virtually, or in a phone environment, or even sometimes inside. I have this like little portfolio I usually bring to in-person interviews. I will put Post-its up that say, "You're awesome. You've got this. Remember, you are an amazing woman," or whatever it is. I know I'm not the only person who does this, but let me tell you, it does totally works for me. And I know it works for lots of other folks. So think about that pep talk. These are small, little bitty things. They may not seem like they're huge, but a lot of times those small things add up to help you be a little bit less nervous. So, all right, I'm going to try to wrap up. So I've got a lot of slides, but I'm going to try to get through it so we have time for questions. So before your interview, again, research. Practice those common interview questions. Create your list of questions to ask, greatest hits. Think about your why. I think the only one on here that I haven't really talked about is completing a mock interview. So one, I'm going to have a slide on this in a few, but we do mock interviews in the Active Career Advising Center. I do them all the time. I make students who take HPE 390 with me do a mock interview. Do a mock interview. They're so great. It gives you an opportunity to practice with somebody who can give you constructive feedback. It is so helpful. If that's not available to you because of timing or whatever, do a mock interview with a friend or a family member. That's totally cool. That's a great way to practice. The other thing I highly recommend is recording yourself. Now, for some of us, this can give us the totally like ick vibes of like, I really don't want to watch myself on camera, but it is so helpful. You might learn things that you didn't realize you were doing. Maybe it's speech patterns. Maybe it's the fact that you do wave your arms like this, or when you get anxious, you crumple in, right? You can see those things when you record. So I highly encourage you to do that and then watch it back and see what you can take from that. All right. What should you do during your interview? Be professional. I think the other thing that's really important, and this kind of harkens back to what Brooklyn was saying earlier, it's all part of the interview. So the moment you start engaging with somebody about an interview, they are paying attention to all of that. That means your emails, your phone conversations, when you're in the waiting room, all of it, the way you interact afterwards. So make sure you're on your P's and Q's the whole time. When you're in the interview, please be attentive. It's really not a great experience for the interviewer if you are spacing out or not paying attention while they're interviewing you, not generally sending good vibes. And then the other thing I wanted to say about anxiety and sort of nervousness is sometimes a reframe can be really helpful on this. So our anxiety or our nervousness looks very similar to excitement if you think about those physiological parts that go with it. And sometimes it's better to reframe that anxiety as excitement than it is to try to squash it down and try to be calm. Athletes use this a lot, right? Psyching themselves up before a game. So sometimes that little bit of a buzz of adrenaline can be a good thing that says that we're excited. And so sometimes that small mental shift of telling yourself like, I'm not nervous, I'm excited, right? Can be enough to help push you into a good place. I also encourage you to express gratitude in your interviews. That's a really important piece. And just to try to end as strong as you can in that interview space. So after your interview, that can be one of the worst parts, to be honest, is after the interview is done, because there's not much you can do at that point, right? And you just have to wait. So think about how you're going to continue to manage that anxiety or your nerves or your excitement. Consider doing some self-care to take care of yourself. Also celebrate because you made it to that stage, you got through that interview. And then consider if you want to follow up. So following up could mean sending a thank you note to the folks that interviewed you. It could be asking a question that you just didn't think of when you were in the interview. It could be providing additional information. You got to decide if it's appropriate for the situation and go ahead and do that. All right. I think this is my last slide before my question slide. So just a reminder that you can schedule an appointment with us in the ACA. We all have, ACA being Academic and Career Advising, sorry. We all have specialty areas. I generally work with folks going into healthcare, but I can work with anybody. So if you want help preparing for a particular interview, talk to us, or just in general. We would love to talk with you one-on-one about that. Another thing that a lot of students don't know is that we have a resource page on the ACA website. It's rather new. We kind of snuck it in there. But there is a section that's all about interviewing. There is some questions. There are some STAR method worksheets. So if you were like, I love the STAR method, I really couldn't get that all down fast enough. There are some practice worksheets in there, lots of stuff around STAR. And there's also an interview readiness worksheet that's pretty awesome as well. So be sure to check those out. So that is it. What questions do you guys have? Thoughts? Anything? Vanessa?
Maybe you can talk about multi-part questions, like, because I know that sometimes those can pop up.
Yeah.
And like, is it okay to ask somebody to repeat the question?
Ooh,
what do you do?
Yeah, great. Yeah, so multi-parts are really hard. They come up a lot. So I think there's a couple different things you can do. One is, yes, you can totally ask somebody to, it's a baby handoff. All right, ask somebody to repeat the question. That's totally okay, especially if there's multiple parts. It's also okay to ask if you addressed everything, especially if it's a complicated question. Now, if you're doing that the whole way through, maybe not so good. It may show that you're not being attentive, but it's certainly okay if it's a complicated question to ask. The other thing is you could write things down. So if you are in a space, when you're in a virtual space or the phone, take notes. It's totally cool for you to jot down the different parts so that you can make sure you're addressing that as you go. But yeah, it's certainly okay to ask if you ask somebody to repeat. It's also okay to make sure you covered all of it. A lot of times they'll also let you know if there was a part you missed of that question, but that's a great one. And I think sometimes it's even better, some employers will give you a printed out copy of the questions they're going to ask, which I think is the bee's knees when folks do that, because then you can make sure you're hitting all of those parts. So again, don't be afraid to take notes as you're going as well to sort of deal with that. Any other questions? Oh, and just in general, it's okay to ask somebody to repeat the question. It could also be a great way to buy a little time. So if you don't know what to say and you're trying to figure out what you want to do, as long as you're not doing it like every single question, it is okay to say like, oh, that's great. Can you repeat that one more time? I just want to make sure I got the whole thing. Can you say that question one more time? Totally okay. And again, really nice stalling technique if you need a second to figure out what you want to do. Also, it's okay to pause before you answer. And honestly, if you're answering a multi-part complicated question, I kind of want you to pause. I kind of want you to take a step back and think about it, right? You're processing all of that. So that's totally okay too. Any other questions? Yeah.
So going back to what you're talking about.
Yeah.
How they're like, what is considered too long? I mean, some people talk about like their
Yeah. Yeah, good question. So for those of you on Zoom, if you didn't hear that, the question was basically, how long is too long for telling me about yourself? I think this question comes up in a multitude of forums pretty regularly when I talk to students. So like, how long is too long for any question, right? Like how short is too short? The answer is always something along the lines of whatever actually addresses the question is okay. So if it's a little bit on the short side, but you fully addressed it and you feel comfortable with what you told the folks, that's great. Now, when it comes to tell me about yourself specifically, I would say it kind of also depends on the length of your interview. So if you know you are having a shorter interview, then you probably don't want to spend that long on a tell me about yourself question. If they told you this is a quick 10-minute conversation, don't spend 5 minutes on tell me about yourself, right? You want to use your time wisely. I would say in general though, 30 seconds to 2 minutes, 2 minutes being my top in terms of where to hit for tell me about yourself. I would say most of the time what feels about right is probably somewhere between 30 and 60 seconds. But unless you have a ton of history or a ton of experiences that you think are really relevant. But part of your job is also to edit that down, right, to the most essential parts. But that's about the sweet spot, I would say. Great question. Anything else? Come on, you guys. This is your opportunity to ask me. I'm just kidding. Anything? Anybody on Zoom? I can't see the chat. Okay. All right. Well, if you do come up with any, you can always feel free to email me if you want to set up an appointment. You can find my information on the website. We can definitely talk interview. Seriously, it was so hard for me to cram what I wanted to say into this thing. And it was still incredibly long and not very interactive because I was very nervous about this Zoom and you guys being in person situation. But yeah, I will also be here for a few minutes too if you guys have questions and you want to chat with me one-on-one. Otherwise, I think that's it.